Welcome, welcome, welcome to Writers Read. This is a very special Writers Read event. Let's have a round of applause for Doris. But as you all know, we start Writers Read a special way.
Yes.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Yes. I say it, you say it. Right, right, right.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
Oh, Doris, this is wonderful. But your book has 2 words in the title. I'm going to say the first word. And you are going to say the second word. Are you ready? Finding
Savoonga.
Let's all say it.
Finding Savoonga.
And tell us just a bit about that word, Savoonga.
Well, I don't know too much about it. I'm trying to find out. It is a Yupik Eskimo word, but no one seemed to know exactly what it meant. I can tell you the name of the other village on the island, Gamble. It was named for a missionary who'd been there many years before. But no one was able to tell me much about it, and I've looked all over, can't find it, but it's a Yupik word.
Okay, thank you, Doris. What we're all going to have to imagine is that we all are 24 years old, because that's how old Doris was when she and her dear husband made this decision. 24 years old. I didn't know up from down when I was 24. So, Doris, welcome, welcome. We're so glad to have you today.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And I'll put the book over here. Yes, actually, I was 23 when we made the decision, but about a month or 6 weeks later, I became 24. So 24 is a good round here, so you can figure out how old I am now. Because this was 1951, the summer of 51. Well, while, and I have something here, yes, while sorting through my mother's belongings after her death, I discovered a cache of typed letters, and there were some of them handwritten, that I had written her. Let's see if this works. There they are. Yes. That I had written her when my husband Charles, better known as Todd, his nickname, the one that probably most of you knew him by, these letters were written when I taught school. We taught school from 1951 to 1954 in a remote Yupik Eskimo village on St. Lawrence Island in the northern Bering Sea off the Alaska coast. Well, I took the letters home after I'd found them, after my mother had died, and I threw them in a drawer, and there they remained for decades. A similar collection of letters was found in my sister-in-law's belongings after her death, so we laid claim to them, and they too went into the drawer to be looked at later. Years passed. One evening in late 2020, several months after my husband's death, I was visiting with close friends, Nancy and Neil McReynolds, and the subject of family reminiscences came up. And I mentioned these old letters from St. Lawrence Island. Having visited the island many years later, Neil was interested in our experience. He urged me to do something with the letters, possibly publish them, as they described, he said, life in a long-gone pre-industrial hunting society. I wasn't enthusiastic. However, the COVID epidemic was raging. We were quarantined, as some of you may remember, and my daily activities were increasingly limited. So I decided, if nothing else, I would type the letters into a document file on the computer that I could reread them and remember what I had written. Many months later, the letters were in the computer. After organizing them into chapters, I wondered if maybe they should be published or could be published. I needed the advice of an old friend, Kent Sturgis, whom I had known first when he was a student and I was a teacher at Lathrop High School in Fairbanks in the 1960s. Kent had been professionally involved in publishing in Seattle. I knew his expertise and advice would be invaluable. When we moved to Seattle from Fairbanks, we would often get together with Patty and Kent for dinner and party often. However, over the years, they had moved and we had moved, and somehow I was unable to locate his telephone number or email address. Well, I mentioned my dilemma in a 1921 Christmas letter to a fellow named Bruce Heflinger, another student from mine in early 1960s who had become a lifelong friend. And the next thing I knew, I was having a telephone conversation with Alan Wilkin, still another good friend, another former student, and a member of the Lathrop High School Old Boys Network. Bruce had gotten in touch with Alan. Alan knew how to get in touch with Kent. And of course, a telephone reunion with Kent resulted in his agreement to edit the letters and arrange for possible publication. Indeed, without Kent's careful editing and suggestions that improved the manuscript, this project would not have come to fruition. Fortunately, Kent now lives in Everett, not far away, and he and Patty are with us today. Kent, would you stand up, and Patty, and yes, here in the front row. I want to introduce Kent, who was completely instrumental in this project coming to fruition. Where am I here? Oh, here I am. Well, I'm going to give a brief summary of how we arrived at Savoonga for those of you who did not see my earlier Writers Read programs, and but very brief. In the summer of 1951, at that point, age 23, Todd and I were engaged to be married. Todd, a World War II veteran, was finishing his undergraduate education that summer at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And on a whim, we had applied for teaching positions with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in July, I had received a telegram offering us a, quote, a two-teacher appointment to the elementary school at Savoonga, St. Lawrence Island, Alaska. Well, after going to the library and tracing the coast of Alaska from southeast all the way up to the northwest. We finally found Savoonga and found, I should say, St. Lawrence Island in the northern Bering Sea, about 150 miles south of the Bering Straits and much closer to Siberia, only 36 miles, as you can see. I think I pushed this. She said in it. Well, oh, there it is. There's the little red thing. Yes, you can see her. 36 miles from Siberia, and of course it was something like 164 miles to Nome, way over here. So you can see we were way out in the northern Bering Sea. A brief, did I move that little red thing away? I guess I did. A brief encyclopedia entry described a treeless tundra with two small Yupik villages, Savoonga here and Gamble here, and a herd, and of course Savoonga, the encyclopedia said, had a population of 249 people. Gamble was the metropolis. It had 309 people. And a herd of 10,000 reindeer, according to the article. Well, after much discussion, we concluded that we'd been offered an opportunity for a unique experience that we should take advantage of for at least a year before moving on with our professional lives and family responsibilities. Accordingly, we sent a telegram to the Bureau of Indian Affairs accepting the positions. And of course, I might also say that while this map looks as if there are all sorts of settlements and things on the island, there simply weren't. Some of these, and looking at them closely, are descriptions of geographical features like bays and capes and so on. And a number of them are actually hunting camps or trapping camps, you know, a little hut on the tundra that people would use. So it is not populated, or it certainly wasn't in 1951. Well, because the small co-op store in Savoonga stocked very few groceries, we would have to place a large order of food to last for the entire school year. I was in a quandary. What to order? I had never prepared meals for 2 people for a week, let alone a year. I might add, for those of you who are getting somewhat close to my age, you may recall that in 1951, people who weren't married, most of them were not living together. So I had never cooked for any period of time. Well, time was running short. Our order had to be put aboard a government freighter, the North Star, which was leaving Seattle on its second and final Alaska trip of the year on August 1st, about 2 weeks from then. And time was running out. Fortunately, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was helpful as we planned the 3,000-mile move to remote St. Lawrence Island. Especially welcome was a detailed list of recommended groceries and dry goods that could be ordered from a Seattle wholesaler and delivered directly to the North Star. Neither of us had sufficient funds to purchase a year's worth of food. So the BIA offered to pay for the order and deduct the funds from our salaries to reimburse the government. finally came the last week of August. The next day, Todd's commencement at the University of Colorado took place. The next day, our families and a few friends gathered in Denver for a small wedding. And bright and early on Tuesday, August 28th, we boarded a Union Pacific train bound for the Pacific Northwest and on to Alaska. My mother was understandably upset that her only child was going to the far ends of the earth, as she put it, informed me that I could not go to my new home without a house plan. So on the station platform, she presented me with violet. And so off I went on the train with Todd, carrying in my lap an African violet that we named Virgil. I'll skip our travels north with stops in Seattle, Juneau, then in Anchorage, and finally we got to Nome after signing contracts, acquiring needed information and orientation. And by the time we reached Nome, we learned that we were 2/3 of the non-native population in Savoonga. The other 1/3 being a Presbyterian missionary named Alice Green. The school staff, who were villagers, included a teaching aide and a custodian. We also learned that although a territorial government nurse was to arrive on the island and share time between the two villages, Savoonga and Gamble, the other village, she would not be arriving until sometime after the new year. Consequently, we would also be responsible for providing medical services in the village. We could consult with an Alaska Native Service doctor in Kotzebue who took calls each evening by shortwave radio. However, for the most part, we were on our own. But the school had a clinic with all kinds of medicines, believe me. In Nome, we also learned that we would have to fly to Gamble, the other village on the island, and then would travel to Savoonga, some 40 miles over the Bering Sea in an umiak, a native walrus-skin boat. Oops. There. That is, actually, those are some fellas getting ready to go fishing in an umiak. Let's see. Yes. Well, to make a long story relatively short, we finally made it to Savoonga several days later. Not an easy journey to make. And with Virgil, the African violet, still in a box on my lap, and the umiak on the Bering Sea. We found that communication between the village and the outside world was either by U.S. Postal Service or by shortwave radio, with the only transmitter in the village being in the school. Let me show you some pictures of the village. No, I'm going the wrong way. Here. Yes, this is a picture of Savoonga. Another picture, you can see the ground is tundra type that would get quite muddy in the summer, and they had consequently built wooden sidewalks around the village. At any rate, back to the Postal Service. The Postal Service for shortwave radio, with the only transmitter in the village being in the school. Consequently, in addition to teaching and medical duties, Todd had nightly radio schedules with the Alaska Communication System for telegrams and with government officials in Nome, as well as the doctor in Kotzebue when necessary. And the only way male and humans could get to gamble for air transportation to and from the island was by native skin boat during the summer and dog team during the winter. No roads, no air to and from Savoonga. Our living quarters were attached to the school. Our living quarters were attached to the school, and utilities were primitive to say the least. And this part of the building was the school. This part back here was our quarters attached to the school. Electricity was provided by a generator in the utility room at the back of the building, which was turned on in the morning and off again at bedtime. Heat came from an oil stove in each classroom and in our living room and kitchen. One was an oil cook stove. Bedrooms were unheated and often below freezing in the winter. Our water supply was a major problem. As I wrote to my mother, we have ordered a pump. We have ordered a pump to bring water during the summer from the creek, which is about 300 yards from the school. Picture of the school. You bring it up from the creek to a large storage tank in our utility room at the rear of the building. Meantime, Todd and some of the older boys are carrying water in pails. Last weekend, Todd splurged by carrying in 2 large containers full of water so we could take real baths in the bathtub. We heated water on the stove, and it was the most enjoyable evening I've spent since leaving Savoonga. You would never think that a plain, ordinary bath could be such a treat. We've almost decided to do this once a week, provided our water supplier, Todd, holds out and the water pipes under the bathtub don't freeze. I might add that there was no real plumbing, no flush toilet, just a chemical toilet that had to be emptied regularly. During the winter, we had a special fund to pay for ice that could be cut and melted. The villagers cut large blocks of ice from a nearby lake, and then they would bring it to the school by dog team, and we would then store it behind the shed on a rack, and it was then brought into the storage tank as needed to be melted. Oh dear, I'm at page 15 in the middle here. Yeah, to be melted. But I also kept a large pot of boiled water in our kitchen counter for drinking and cooking. Well, as the days grew colder, it became apparent that we would need warmer winter wear. St. Lawrence Island women wore parkas typically made from blankets, and they were decorated with black fur trim around the face, which of course could be pulled down because of the fierce winds that we had. The winds swept down from the North Pole straight down over the Arctic Ocean and straight down over the Bering Sea, so winds were sometimes quite heavy. The parkas then were covered with brightly colored snow shirts that could be removed for washing. Men's parkas, which had at one time been made from animal skins, were often purchased from an Army-Navy store in Nome and covered in a white or khaki cloth. And you can see here that my friend Fred Okenmillingnock had returned the particular afternoon from hunting seal, and you'll notice that his pants were sealskin, made of sealskin. Quite warm. One of the village women made a parka for me from blankets that we had found at the school, and in early January 1952, I wrote to my mother, "Well, after a mild fall, the weather has become much colder. Tonight it is about -6, and the wind makes it seem much colder. But I'm all set for winter. May Kingicut," one of the villagers, "finished my parka this week. It is toasty warm and so pretty. I'll have Todd take a photograph of it. It is made of soft," the snow shirt was made of soft flannelette decorated with figures of skiers and black fir trees printed on it. We also have some heavy ski pants that the government provided left in the school, so we are warm when we go outside. The women all tell me I look like a real Eskimo. And when the children see me, they all say, "Ka, ka," which is Yupik for, "Oh, look." I might parenthetically tell you what happened. Kent remembers the problem we had with some of the pictures that, these pictures are virtually all made at the time, taken with our cameras, and this particular picture was a black and white photograph that was in my photograph album. And we had sent a lot of the slides and some of the black and whites down to a company in Portland to try to clean them and renovate them because they were as old as we were at that time, of course, 70-some years old. So at any rate, when this picture came back, and the people working on it had actually colorized these black and white photos from my photo album. But this picture came back and the parka was blue. And I said to Ken, "Oh, you can't have a blue parka. I'm describing it and I'm going to illustrate it to my mother, and it's a red parka." So we had to send it back and get it remade into red. So, at any rate, May Kingicut was concerned that the new parka that Todd had ordered from Nome would not be warm enough because it didn't have fur on the hood over the face. And so she found some fur and sent one of her daughters over to get his parka. She was going to fix it. We slipped it out of the house without Todd knowing it was gone. And that evening, May and her husband Theodore brought it back. Todd was so happy with it, and of course May was pleased. She refused to accept any payment. Well, the book is filled with adventures, our adventures in the classroom, despite the fact that my little beginners and first graders came to school with no knowledge of English, the language that we used in the school. They were eager to learn, mostly, and enjoyed our various activities and outings. As I wrote to my mother, I often play outside with my little children and sometimes invite them into the house for tea parties with cookies and fruit juice. Todd says I finally found some friends on my own level. It's true. I have so much fun with the little ones as we sit in a big circle on the floor and jabber to each other, mostly in Yupik. I would learn a few words of Yupik as they would learn a few words of English, and we would get along. Todd commented in a letter to his sister's family, "Doris's children tease her a lot and have a great time. When she held up a picture of an owl yesterday, a chorus of little voices informed Doris that it was an anipa, which is Yupik for owl. Then they howled with laughter. Doris seems to be picking up as many Yupik words as they are learning English words. If we stay long enough, we all may have a common language. In another letter I wrote, pictures here, I wrote, the children are finally past their shyness. In fact, they've become quite talkative. We sometimes have discipline problems. Anything serious is referred to the welfare committee, a committee of the village council, to decide punishments. For example, quite a few older children were coming to school late every day. Todd would keep them in at recess, but that punishment didn't seem to faze them. So after discussing the problem with the welfare committee, it was decided that any child who came late or who otherwise misbehaved would have to stay after school and scrub the school walls and floors. Since then, few children have been late. We enjoy our life in Savoonga. As I explained to our families, the villagers are open and friendly. They have a rich culture and a deep sense of humanity. Everything is shared. There is meat for every family in the village, even if some of the hunters don't bring home a walrus or a seal. The old people are always taken care of, so there is no need for help from outsiders. Indeed, only a few of the old people have applied for government benefits, which I was responsible for helping them to get. Everyone seems to have a wonderful sense of humor. Even my little children love to tease me. And so over the winter months, we decided to stay for a second year, and then later, finally, for a third year. Well, a few vignettes from the book. In late January 1952, the nurse finally arrived. I described her in a letter to my mother. She's almost as tall as Todd, and I suspect weighs about 250 pounds. I cringe every time she sits down on one of our chairs for fear it will break. She will be here for about 3 months and then go to Gamble for 3 months. She may have difficulty getting into some of these homes, as many of the doors are so narrow that I have trouble getting inside. On her first day, she came over to work in the school clinic, which also became the nurses' clinic, and she left the building just as my little children were coming in from recess. She really stands out in her red parka trimmed with wolf fur. When I returned to the classroom, the children were crowded at the window watching her as she trudged home. One of the more precocious little rascals announced, "There goes Santa Claus." As I mentioned, our yearly supply of food was shipped in by the North Star, a government ship from Seattle that visited the village twice each year, bringing, and this is the North Star, bringing school and some village supplies. And go ahead to show you that these are people in an umiak had come out to the boat possibly to see the nurse that was on the ship. And they came out for some reason. And you can see here the boats from the village lightering the supplies from the ship to shore. And then after, when they came ashore, the women and the younger children would pull them up and deliver them to the school or the store, wherever they were going. During its summer visit in 1952, the North Star, we were invited out to the ship for lunch with Captain Solengus, a crusty old Scandinavian. The captain expressed wonder about Todd and I being together as two of only 3 non-natives in such an isolated place, and asked how long we'd been married. I breezily responded, "Oh, we've been married for 10 months. "Well," he said, sucking on his pipe as he bid us farewell, "you'll either be married for life or come out in separate skin boats." It's difficult to comprehend how completely isolated Savoonga was when we lived there. And whenever a non-native came to the village for research or medical work or military, whatever, it was expected that he would stay with the teachers. So from time to time, we ran a hotel service, complete with 3 meals a day. And we were typically forewarned by shortwave radio messages that someone would be coming. We would get messages either from Gamble or from Nome. In a note to my mother in the summer of 1952, I wrote, "August 3rd, dear mother, you won't believe what happened in the middle of the night a couple of days ago. At about 1 a.m., I was awakened by a loud knock on our living room door. I poked Todd. Someone's at the door. Well, go see what they want." So I went to the door, and there was a white man, a stranger. I quickly closed the door and rushed back to the bedroom. "There's a strange white man out in the hall," I exclaimed. "Well, ask him in," Todd replied, turning over and going back to sleep. So I returned to the door, invited the stranger to come in. He was cold and wet, having come in one of the skin boats that was returning to Gamble from the radar station at Northeast Cape, a radar station that was about 60 miles the other way down the eastern end of the island. The stranger's name is Henry Michael, an archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania. He has been studying archaeological sites. The Gamble skin boat crew had stopped in Savoonga for rest and something to eat with relatives. The 2 villages were completely related, and suggested that Henry might get fed at the school. Well, while I visited with him, I cooked a breakfast of bacon and eggs, which he wolfed down with enthusiasm. Then I made up the hide a bed in the living room for him to rest on until the skin boat was ready to resume the sea journey to Gamble. A couple of hours later, the skin boat captain appeared at the door. It was time to go. I gave Henry a pair of Todd's socks and a sweater to keep him warm, and away he went. It was quite an unexpected adventure in the middle of the night. Todd slept through the whole A week or so later, the Coast Guard cutter Stora stopped in Savoonga for the day. Some of you old-timers here in Seattle may remember the Storas was stationed here in Seattle. The ship's doctor came ashore to do some medical work, and the captain invited us out to the ship for dinner. Since the ship was going on to Gamble that night, but will be coming back past Savoonga the following night, the captain offered to take Todd and me over to Gamble for the day. We accepted the invitation. An adventure. Todd and I shared the Admiral's cabin. The Admiral was not aboard. However, it turned out to be a miserable, stormy day. By evening, the weather was so bad that the ship sailed away. And there we were, stuck in Gamble again, in the middle of the most severe storm we had seen since arriving on St. Lawrence Island. After several days marooned in Gamble, we returned via skim boat to Savoonga, and with us was the archaeologist Henry Michael, who moved in with us, of course, for several days while doing some work at an archaeological site near Savoonga. And thus began a lifelong friendship. We met his wife later and remained good friends. Henry is the one, as you can tell here, in the center of the boat. Todd, of course, was taking the pictures. I spoke earlier about our less than ideal plumbing conditions, which brings to mind a letter written to my mother in January 1953. Dear Mother, I must relate an incident that occurred a couple of weeks ago, causing considerable consternation in the Ray family. As you know, we both acquired new taku jackets over the holidays, and the sealskin-soled mucklucks that we have been wearing were Christmas gifts from the mother of one of my little first graders, because, as she said, Gregory like you. At any rate, and of course, this was Mabel Tooley, who had given us the mucklucks for Christmas, which you will see in a minute. And here she is holding some, actually it is white leather that she made by skinning seals and bleaching them, and used that leather then for mucklucks, trim on mucklucks. This is Todd and me in our new taku jackets with our new mucklucks that were given to us at Christmas by Mabel Tooley, because Gregory like you. At any rate, you may recall one of Todd's more onerous tasks is carrying out the bucket from the chemical toilet and emptying it in the disposal area on the sea ice, where it is carried away in the spring. As he was about, this is my mother, as he was about to do this, he came into the house wearing my new jacket. When I asked why he had put on my jacket instead of his own, they were both hanging in the hall outside the door. One is red, one is blue. He replied, well, you see, I'm wearing these new mucklucks. The soles are slippery, and if I fall while carrying the toilet bucket, I certainly don't want to mess up my new jacket. Well, we both chuckled, but Todd didn't bother to remove my jacket, which he had mistaken for his own. How so, I don't know. And off he went on his repugnant task. You can guess what happened. A short time later, Todd came in, having slipped on the ice, with my new jacket fouled by the contents of the toilet. I was livid. You did this on purpose. And no amount of reasonable explanation as to why he would have done this to himself could convince me that it had been an accident. Fortunately, the removable outer covering of the jacket was washable, and the jacket has been restored almost to its original condition. In retrospect, we laugh about this episode, considering it to be par for the course of life in an Alaskan village. After vacationing in the States, and I'm not forgetting you people way over there on the left, I don't get my head around too much here. After vacationing in the States to visit family during the summer of 1953, we returned to Savoonga in the fall for a third year before moving to New York and graduate studies at Columbia University. However, by November, we were in the full throes of a measles epidemic. And as usually was the case, whenever an emergency arose, the nurse was not in the village. In a letter written in late November 1953 to my mother, I said, "Dear Mother, we are so thankful the measles epidemic is behind us. It was a terrible ordeal for everyone. I haven't had time before now to write you about our experience. The epidemic of rubeola virus, those are the red measles, the serious kind, broke out in Savoonga and Gamble after visits by the North Star. With no natural immunity, and don't forget these were in the days long before the vaccine for measles had been developed. With no natural immunity, the only villagers not susceptible to the disease were elders who had survived a measles epidemic brought to Savoonga by whaling ships about 60 years ago. Fortunately, Todd and I are measled, as Clarence Klingawi put it, meaning that we don't have to worry because we have both had measles when we were children. We were measled. As the epidemic spread, Todd and I, of course, we had to close school because the students were ill and the families were ill. As the epidemic spread, Todd and I divided the village between us and made twice daily rounds. We were shocked upon entering one-room homes to find rows of sick people wrapped in sleeping bags and other bedding spread out across the floor. Soon this scene became commonplace as we did our best to care for everyone. In the evening, we would return to check on those who were most seriously ill. Todd was the doctor, of course. Todd was the doctor and carried the official medical bag. As doctor substitute, I filled an over-the-shoulder handbag with medications and supplies, including thermometers, aspirin, alcohol for disinfectant, and individually wrapped penicillin shots. Todd maintained short-wave communications twice a day with the Alaska Native Service representative in Nome. He also spoke often with the doctor at the Alaska Native Service Hospital in Kotzebue, who gave us instructions for the care of the measles patients. We quickly learned there was little to be done for most patients other than provide aspirin, keep their rooms dark, and ensure they remained indoors and got plenty of rest. An ANS, Alaska Native Service doctor in Kotzebue, recommended a shot of penicillin and an alcohol bath, that is, rubbing the body with an alcohol swab to cool it, for patients whose temperature rose dangerously high. However, our supply of penicillin ran low. No one in the village was well enough to make a dog sled trip to Gamble for more. Health authorities in Nome attempted an airdrop, but the drop missed its mark, landing far out of reach on the sea ice. After making house calls all day and into the night, Todd and I literally fell into bed exhausted. On more than one occasion, we were wakened by a villager who had entered our quarters and was standing over our bed, flashlight in hand, gently shaking Todd awake. The villager urged him, "You come now," explaining that someone was seriously ill. So wearily, Todd would get up, dress, go off to see the patient, and returned later to his warm bed for another few hours of sleep. We were lucky to have had just one death, but we treated many life-threatening cases. One of the most serious was that of a little girl barely a year old, whose parents, Joseph and Catherine Noongook, had brought her back to the village from a trapping camp. First, on top of the measles, she developed pneumonia, and then her temperature soared. The doctor said she should be given alcohol rubs every 4 hours. Todd would visit the child to give alcohol rubs throughout the day, and again just before our bedtime around 10 in the evening, he would go over again. Then returning home, he would set his alarm for 1:45 a.m. to go back for another alcohol rub. The first time Todd returned at 2 a.m., the parents were surprised, somewhat annoyed at being awakened in the middle of the night. The little girl was so ill, she was just lying quietly, not even crying. Exasperated, Todd explained, "Baby is very ill. Her temperature is 107.8 degrees. When temperature goes to 106 degrees, people usually die. I must keep her cool." Now this got their attention. They were grateful when they understood how serious the situation was. One uncommon sight during the epidemic gave us a weary chuckle. With so many villagers ill and unable to do their daily chores, it became the task of several elders who had survived the measles many years before and were immune to it to carry out their family honey buckets and empty them on the shore ice at the mouth of the frozen creek. This onerous task was usually assigned to the younger members of the family, typically girls or women, and certainly not to elderly men, the village leaders. We left Savoonga on a spring day in early June 1954, just as we had come 3 years earlier by skin boat on the windy Bering Sea, traveling for about 8 hours to the Air Force Station down at Northeast Cape, where we had arranged to fly on an Air Force plane to Nome. From there, we took commercial flights to Seattle and points east, visiting our families on the way to New York. Little did we know, as we waved goodbye to Savoonga, that we would return many years later. As planned, Todd earned graduate degrees at Columbia. We had expected to spend only a year in New York. However, 1 year stretched into 3 as he pursued doctoral studies. In the spring of 1957, near the end of our 3rd year in New York, Todd was offered a professorship at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks that included a research grant from the U.S. Department of Education to undertake a comprehensive survey of Native education throughout the territory. We returned to Alaska and settled down in Fairbanks, Todd at the university, and I teaching advanced placement history and government at Lathrop High School. Over the years, our careers progressed and we became staunch citizens of Alaska. In the spring of 1983, Todd was invited to Savoonga to give a commencement address to the first high school graduating class. From the newly constructed school that now included grades K through 12. an invitation he was delighted to accept, as was I. Some 30 years after leaving the village, the Alaska we came to as young teachers had seen big changes. The territory became a state in 1959. A major oil discovery was made at Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic slope in 1968. Before the oil could be moved across Alaska through a pipeline to an ice-free port at Valdez on the south central coast, native land claims to sizable portions of the state had to be settled. Consequently, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. The villages of Savoonga and Gamble received title to more than 1 million acres of land on the island. After oil began flowing, tax revenue enabled the state to build modern new schools in many communities throughout Alaska, including Savoonga, where operation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs School had been transferred to the state. We returned to a community far different from the one we left in 1954. No dog sled or skin boat transportation for us. We flew from Nome directly to Savoonga, which by then had daily air service and timely mail delivery. Savoonga had grown with many new houses and larger buildings. This is a picture in 1983. I might add that current population as of 2023 is 750, considerably larger than the 250 when we were there. The store had changed. The store had changed from a one-room building with limited products to a large self-service supermarket that included a frozen food section, fresh produce, and almost anything that could be eaten, worn, or otherwise used. Quite a difference. We were taken from the airport to the principal's home on a snowmobile driven by our old friend Jonathan Anagia. The principal and his wife, with whom we were staying, told us that they planned to get together that evening with the teaching staff, which had been expanded considerably since our time, to watch a football game on TV, and would we care to join them? We declined with thanks, wanting to spend our limited time visiting old friends in the village. In conversations with a few teachers, we inquired about several local families and learned that the teachers had little knowledge about what went on in the community. The new school, that's the old, you can see here. The new school was constructed, let's see here. The new school was constructed in a large open area between the village and the old school. This whole area, well, what has happened here? No, what's happened here?
You go back, sister.
I'm back over here to the yes, I fixed thank goodness you're here. I'm back. Yeah, well, no, okay, the next picture is what I'm talking about. There we go. Yes, you can see this large area between the old school and the village, which is kind of where I am. And that's where they built the new school. And so consequently, it created a large physical barrier, and the old school had been converted into teacher housing. And apparently the teachers were content to live their lives on their side of the barrier, which surprised us because Todd and I have been in and out of people's homes every day and we're active participants in village life. And I might add here parenthetically that it wasn't too long ago that Kent, remember, sent me an email saying he'd read an article from one of the Alaska newspapers that the old school, which was our school, this one, had burned down, the teachers. And that was the second school that had burned down. The original school, which is to the left of this little shed over here, we had a fire, and that had been the nurses. We had fixed that into the nurses' quarters, and that had burned in the spring, summer of 1953, and is shown and talked about in the book. At any rate, I met my old friend, one of Todd's former students, Janet Kinika, in the laundromat. And I found one of my little first graders, Dorcas Kalawi, running the village library. Other new buildings included a clinic and several government offices. Telephone and television service have become available. Thanks to satellite technology, residents of this once remote, isolated village could call anywhere in the world. And this picture to me kind of epitomizes the changes. You can see here the power lines and the satellite disk and the in the middle there is also a car, an automobile in Savoonga. Unbelievable. And of course, roads. And here right in the front is a frame of one of the old umiaks. So the contrast there to me is just quite incredible. One particularly touching moment came when our old friend Catherine Nungwood came to visit, bringing a young woman with her. She told us, "This is the baby whose life you saved from measles." We were delighted to see her, although sorry to learn that the disease had left her with diminished hearing. We had also become reacquainted on the flight from Nome with Caleb Panawi, whom I had taught in the 3rd grade. By now, in his late 30s, Caleb had become a widely respected activist in Native affairs and a leader in one of the Native corporations that had been created in the land claim settlement. Like Todd, he had been invited to speak to the graduates. Todd is there in the, I think that was Todd and that is Caleb right there, along with one of the graduates. In his address, Caleb spoke about the school. In words I am paraphrasing, he told them, "You have been fortunate to study in this beautiful new building and to have educational opportunities in facilities such as these, which were unavailable to me and my classmates as we grew up. However, we had something that was more important. We had teachers such as Todd and Doris Ray who believed in us and cared about us. We were the fortunate ones." These words bring tears to my eyes, brought tears, and they still do. Despite a prediction in 1952 from the Scandinavian captain of the North Star that pressure on our marriage in a remote village with few non-natives might result in our leaving Savoonga in separate skin boats. Todd and I were married for more than 68 years until his death in 2020. And a reminder that Finding Savoonga, a copy is in our library here, and it's also available for sale on Amazon, also Barnes and Noble, and I suppose in bookstores, although they would, I'm sure, have to order them. I don't imagine they're being heavily stocked.
Well, they should be heavily stocked.
And I'll be happy to answer questions.
Yes. That was just a gift to all of us, a gift to all of us to know every inch of your experience.
Well, not every inch.
Oh,
no,
that was
only a few little vignettes. There were a lot more things that were.
Okay, we'll read the book. We'll read the book. But Karen has a microphone, and Karen's going to start with a story.
Oh,
just a quick story.
Well, a quick
one sentence. This is amazing. She told me this just before this event.
This is nothing to do with Savoonga.
No, it isn't Savoonga.
In, I believe, 1995, Doris won the fishing derby in Valdez, a $10,000 prize. So, may I just say, there are many sides to this woman.
I might also add that we had the fish stuffed because, as I said, I want my husband, I want Todd to be able to see this for the rest of his life. He's the fisherman in the family, and so it came with us to Seattle, and it is up in the study for any of you who would like to see my stuffed salad.
Okay, questions? Okay.
Here's one, right here.
Okay.
I assume, Doris, that you're going to be available for signatures on these books.
I would be happy to autograph.
Nice
Yes,
idea.
indeed so.
That's a great idea. Here's a, yeah. How did you do the laundry?
The water was carried in, and we had a big, vast tank that was filled with water. We did have an electric washer with the old-fashioned dryer, wringer. A couple of galvanized tubs that would be filled for rinsing, and then we would hang them outside, as one did in those days, in the summer, fall, or in the utility room in the winter.
Okay. Oh,
It was not an easy task, and certainly no laundromat at that time.
Is that it? I just want to take a minute, Doris, to tell about the Writer Read Volume 1 and Volume 2. And Doris Ray read for Writers Read, and she is in Volume 1. And Volume 2 has been created because we've had so many writers read. So they're on the bottom shelf. Pam, help me for a minute. They're on the bottom shelf of the last bookcase as you walk toward the window. You'll see them. They're noticeable. Enjoy them. They're precious. They're precious.
No question.
Doris, I want to know how much Yupik you really learned.
Very little. Absolutely. And of course, it's rather interesting at that time. Since then, there have been efforts to print or to put it into a written language. But Yupik is the Yupik people, Eskimos, are Siberian, typically Siberian Yupik. The people from St. Lawrence Island came from Siberia. And in fact, they had relatives in some of the villages in Siberia, short distance away. And in, I think it was in the 1980s or 90s, it was about the time that the transportation and that things opened up after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was an article in the National Geographic describing a trip from Alaska, including some of our Savoonga and Gamble people who returned to Siberia, to the villages right across the way, and got to meet some of their relatives that they had not seen since the 1950s. A lot of this is described in what I didn't put it in this talk, but yeah. But at any rate, there are a number of the native languages. There's Yupik along the coast, and umiak, the Yupik on the islands and down in southwestern Alaska. Inupiaq, which are essentially the Eskimo villages along the coast, which that language is related more to the Canadian and the Icelandic, Greenland, that area. Then of course there are the interior, quote, Indian, if you will, languages that were related to Navajo, interestingly. And then there are the three southeastern native, the Haida, the Tsimshian, and the Tlingit. So essentially, at that time, the only common language was English, which is one of the important reasons why it was obviously being taught. As I say, since then there have been some efforts at putting some of these into written languages.
Yeah. The reason I asked, is this on? Okay. The reason I asked is my nephew's married to a Yupik girl. Okay.
And that's in she's in southwestern.
She's they're in a village up above Dillingham, well inland.
Yeah.
And her father, chief of the tribe, village, speaks no English whatsoever, just Yupik. And all the girls, her sisters, all have university degrees. Her brothers, of course, never went to high school, which is quite typical. Their oldest son, my nephew's oldest child's son. So he went through school, and his mother, of course, was a Yupik teacher. He was a straight A student and everything but Yupik. Gotta be. But anyway, my husband, who studied numerous languages, one time we were back at the DC and the Smithsonian, they had a Yupik exhibit, and they were speaking in Yupik and English at the same time. And Norman listened to that for a while, and he said, "Boy, I'm with Reuben, the son. That is one tough language." But you'll be happy to know that his wife now is retired from high school teaching, and she's working with the University of Fairbanks and the Canadians to get the Yupik all in the written language. This is she's dedicated to it. So, is there?
That's great. Yeah, very helpful.
Doris, speaking of languages, you sent a copious amount of letters to your mother. But my opinion of living there was that mail came twice a year, if at all. Please explain.
Mail came when the planes, first of all, the planes came to Gamble, not to Savoonga. And Alaska Airlines came twice a month, every 2 weeks. And in the winter, when they could land on the lake, when the lake was thick enough, the ice, for planes to land. And then in the spring and fall, as the lake was melting or freezing, there was a period when we did not have regular mail. And in the summer, there were they would fly over with a PBY that would land on the lake. So typically, when we were doing well, we would get mail a couple of times a month, every 2 weeks. The mail, of course, had to be brought then from Gamble to Savoonga by umiak when, in the spring, summer, fall, and by dog sled, dog team in the winter. And so it was a sometimes not very regular form of mail. And then we would sometimes get whole bunches of it at a time.
Okay. Any other questions? What a rich
There's one way back here, Judy. Yeah.
Oh, there's something here, sorry.
Yeah. Linda, Judy has one.
Judy Eskimo.
Yeah. And then, Ina has one, and then Judy, yeah.
Okay.
In your book, you described trying to teach the kids English, and you had books that were for American kids, the Dick and Jane type of, with no picket fences and trees and flowers.
And merry-go-rounds.
There's no trees on the island. Please explain. How did you do it?
They just, well, one of the things, obviously, we used them to the extent I could, but I also then learned quickly to make, well, there were stories, find stories about villagers in other parts of Alaska. And actually, we would go on walks, and I would also make cards with pictures of various things that they used and saw and so on, and would put the English word, and they would say the Yupik word, and I would say the English word, and so in some ways I was able to do that as well. But yes, can you imagine trying to teach with Dick and Jane, whose grandparents, and Spot and Puff, their dogs were not pets. Their dogs were like, like the automobiles that apparently some of them had right later. But they would be fed like putting gas into a car when they were needed but they were not fed very well. And so it was difficult, not only not knowing the language, but the concepts were so different. Talking about buses and going to grandfather's farm. And I can remember telling them about grandfather's farm and barns, and then the words that were introduced, farm and barn. And that might have been fine 70 years ago for a lot of kids in the States, but they were very helpful. They would talk about barns and farms and barns and barns, and it made as much sense to them as
Doris, I'm seeing Nancy McReynolds, and I think we should thank her for urging this book to come into fruition.
Thank you.
Judy.
Yeah, Judy.
Doris, I don't know if we covered this, but why was this village established in such a remote location? What was the reason for putting a village there?
Oh, well, it was Gamble, of course, which was the first village. Savoonga actually was built considerably later in the, it would have been in the early part of the 20th century, 1910s, 50s, when reindeer were introduced to the island, and the reindeer herds were not very successful. One of the men, the two old men whom I showed you, there they are. Amos, the one to the right was one of the first herders of the reindeer. This reindeer had been introduced in Alaska by Sheldon Jackson, missionary who was also active in government affairs in the late 19th, early 20th century, to provide food, they thought, for some of the native villages that had been having problems with hunting and so on. And they also introduced St. Lawrence Island. And so Savoonga was started by the reindeer herders to start with. And it was not very successful because they were not herders, they were hunters. And they liked walrus, they liked seals, they liked birds. They did not necessarily like to herd reindeer, so the reindeer pretty well disappeared. But it was good hunting. Also over on the Gamble side, whales, lots of whales would come through that area. Lots of food. They were hunters, you know, and so there was an area that, and of course the walrus came down from the north in the fall and back up in the ice flows in the summer.
When I Googled Savoonga, it said it's the walrus capital of the world. Good information, Ginny.
Doris, you know I'm such a fan of your book, and when I got in the elevator, I think this morning, and I pointed to the poster of your book, I said to the person in the elevator with me, I said, "You've got to read this book and come hear Doris speak." And she said, "I've read the book too." And I said, "Don't you wish there was more from year 3? And I want to read the letters that you wrote home when you moved to New York City after living in Savoonga." And you said, "Well, maybe there'll be a volume 2. I want you to say, I hope that you could write a volume 2. It would be so interesting to hear that the transition, getting ready for the transition, and then the transition to New York City.
We'll think
What
about
a
it.
wonderful book.
Well, New York was a wonderful experience. It was quite a different, needless to say, a different experience. At one time, my husband, who was known for making smart remarks, said to a group something about our going to New York from Savoonga, and it was quite a culture shock. And he quipped, "Yes, those New Yorkers are an odd bunch," which did not sit well with the person one of the people we were talking to, who was a native New Yorker. And of course, I guess she didn't realize he was kidding. You know, we love New York. In fact, went back many, many, many times. Lived there, we're there on sabbatical leave and so on. So, love New York.
Oh,
Any
thank you
other?
so much.
Yeah.
Okay, let's